Welcome guys to the watercolor elephants tutorial. This is a quick tutorial that is going to walk you through the process that you need to follow in order to create this watercolor elephants piece. So this one is done on 300 GSM watercolor paper that's been scored by a Cricut. So the design is already on there for you, and you're literally going to block in the colors that we need to do following the score lines, as you can see there. So the first thing you want to do is wash your hands with soap and dry them thoroughly to make sure that you don't have any oils or anything on your fingers or hands, and then basically work your way through unpacking your kit. Set it all up in front of you and just make sure that you've got all the materials that you need, including a glass of water in front of you. You need to open up your watercolor palette, retrieve the brush, and after examining the scored watercolor paper, you just want to pull out your practice version first. So your pack does come with two scored pages in there, and the first one is going to be your practice version. So the first thing you want to do is dip your brush in water, choose the first color you want to work with. We generally recommend starting with the balloons, so have a think about the colors that you want to use for that particular part. What you're going to do is you're going to agitate the surface of the watercolor palette, and as you can see here, you will skirt the inside of the circumference of the balloon. And once the watercolor paint on the end of your brush has run out, you're going to dip it into water and continue to work your way into the middle. So what this is going to do is dilute the color. So this time you can see I've picked up a green color, and the first thing I do is walk around the inside with my brush to create a bit of a circle on the inside circumference of the watercolor balloon, and then I start to block the color in around it. As soon as I run out of color, I will dip it into the water to spread it out, and then I will work my way through the balloons one at a time until I've done them all. Basically what you're aiming for is to have a really dark color around the circumference. So taking plenty of pigment. You can see me agitating the brush there to pick the pigment up and mix it with the water in order to be able to spread it. So once you do paint it down, it'll be quite dark around the outside, and then you'll take water to mix on the inside. So it'll be quite diluted in the middle, depending on how much pigment you pick up. So you can see on the pink balloon, the first one that I painted on there, this effect is quite dramatic there. On the sort of greeny turquoise balloon, not so much because I've used more pigment there. And the same for the orange. So it depends on the desired effect, but you do get two scored sheets to practice with, so you may want to try both on the practice version and then decide on what you're going to do on the good copy. So again, agitating the surface and working your way through each one of these balloons one at a time. So the scored sheet is scored pretty well. You'll be able to see exactly where you do need to apply the colour, and you just want to work from one part of your painting to the next. There's no rules around how much that you need to paint or how much you don't. The example version that we provide doesn't include the elephant painted, but we have seen many people do it, and it does look lovely when you do it. There's no rules around colour either. With the metallic watercolour palettes, when they arrive, they kind of look half filled, but it's because of the nature and the way that they make the metallic colours that they sort of sit that way. And they do take quite a bit of agitation to get a nice thick pigment because of the mica powders that they use inside there in order to make it metallic. So when you're first painting it on, it's not going to look terribly metallic, depending on the angle, I suppose, that you're sitting at. But as it dries, it does definitely start to get that sparkle that you would expect from any sort of metallic paint. These particular kits, I think, have 16 different colours that you can work with. They're all pretty great. And I would just encourage you to experiment with the depth of colour that you like. So you can see I'm working my way through the balloons now. So once I've done those, you will see that I will start to move on to the flowers, then the dots, and then the stars on that particular piece. The process is the same for all of them, although because you're working on smaller parts with the stars and the flowers and that sort of stuff, you're going to find that you won't actually need to do that dilution part of the watercolour, so you're not going to get quite as much happening with them. It will just be quite solid deposits of colour all over that part. So just continue to block it all in until you have worked your way through the piece using the same technique. So while you're watching that, we might just talk for a moment about what watercolour actually is. So At its most basic, the word watercolor basically describes a medium in which a dry pigment is mixed first with a binder, which is usually a gum, and then with water, and then is applied with a brush to support, such as paper. But it's been used on many, many things. When it dries, the binder sticks that pigment onto the support. So in this particular instance, we're using metallic watercolors, which obviously have like a mica powder mixed through with it to give it that sheen. And the support that we're using is the 300 GSM German watercolor paper, which is just beautiful. It's a rough tooth paper, and it sucks up all of the pigment perfectly. In terms of the technique that we're actually using for this particular piece, it's called a wet on dry technique, which is basically the applying of a wet pigment paint to a dry paper, or a wet paint onto the area of dry paint. This technique basically allows for more control and quite crisp and defined edges on our painting, which is pretty much what we're going for when we're looking at this one. It's got an element of whimsy to it, so we are looking for those nice crisp edges as opposed to the bleeding. You can see here I'm now working my way through all of the stars and the little flowers that are scored into the surface there. I find with those ones I just use the tip of my brush and it fills it in nicely, leaves a nice solid look to it. Too much water and it's going to bleed over the edges because the score lines are quite small. So you don't want to use too much water, too much pigment. Just work your way through them very slowly in whichever colours that you want to use. So as you work your way through it, you're expecting to see that those balloons have quite a dark colour around the outside, and it gets lighter towards the middle, and all of the small score work like the stars and the bubbles and the flowers will be quite a solid colour. As it's drying, you can see that the dry time isn't too long for this particular piece. The watercolour paper is soaking that water up wonderfully, and we are starting to see that metallic sheen coming through. You will notice that at the bottom of your watercolour palette that there is a colour that is a sort of creamy, silvery colour. It's the bottom right-hand corner, and once you've finished working your way through all the different parts of your painting, I do come back, and you'll see in a moment, me agitate that colour and pop it on the end of my brush, and then swing a sort of half circumference line that skirts around the edge of the balloon, and basically it's just to give a bit of dimension to make it look round, a bit of shine to mimic the shine of the light. So once all the dots and everything's been filled in, you'll find that I double back just to do that last step, and that of course will finish off that space. Now if you do want to do your elephant, please go ahead and do it. I would encourage you to probably work on that elephant slightly different to the way you do with the balloons. I would encourage you to use a wet on wet technique, meaning that you would first paint the elephant with water and then come back with the paint, starting from the circumference again and working your way into the middle. It's just such a big part of the painting that if you are going to block it in with colour, you don't want it to be one flat colour. You would like to see, the colour depth changing as you work your way towards the middle of that painting, just to give it a bit of shape. Just some interesting facts about watercolour while I do finish this part of the painting off and before I move on to the next. The medium of watercolour has actually been around for a really long time. It's been associated with England for several hundred years, but its origins are actually much further back in history than that. Particularly well past European painting. The pigments originally consisted of earth and vegetable fibres that were kind of ground down into a powder and bound with a gum or egg in some cases. And they were used in the Middle Ages. They were applied with a vellum to manuscripts to depict religious scenes. And they were quite beautiful. So that's sort of the origins of where watercolour has come from. Interestingly though, the original technique, or one of the original techniques with watercolour, was actually to mix it with an opaque pigment, like a lead white, to give it body and more intensity, I guess, to the particular painting. So, we obviously know that watercolour, or various versions of watercolour, particularly here in Australia, have been used in different ways in cave paintings and stuff using ochre by Indigenous Australians. So it did start long before Europeans found it. So from here on in, you're just going to finish blocking in those colours, and then you will move on to following the scored lines with a pen to outline it. You can outline as little or as much as you want. With this particular piece, the advertised piece, will have you outlining the elephant and the streamers, but it does look quite cute when you do the balloons also, or you can do little half streamers that look a bit like a pig's tail in between. Looks very cute. For this particular one though, we have just done the elephant and the streamers. There are no real rules to how you do it. We encourage you to use a pen like, you know, what kids use for drawing with, or you can use like a laundry marker. Fine liner works well too. A slightly thicker nib will give you a better result. Even a Sharpie will do the trick. So we're going to speed this up so that you can get right to the end of your piece and see the final product, and we'll go from there. So as you can see, I'm just outlining the streamers there and finishing it off. And once that's done, you've actually finished your painting. So you'll turn it around, have a bit of a look, enjoy that, and pop it in its frame. Thanks for joining us, guys.